At the Springfield Armory Museum in Massachusetts, in a drawer not meant for display, there is an unfinished rifle stock, rough from the shaping rasp, never inletted for a barrel, never fitted with a lock. The shell of a gun that was ordered, and then, before it could be finished, unordered. It is the only piece of its pattern that anyone can point to. Between 1861 and 1865, the Union Ordnance Department contracted, tested, or provisionally accepted more than 30 distinct patterns of pistol, revolver, carbine, and rifle musket, beyond the 4 or 5 names everyone still knows: the Springfield, the Colt, the Sharps, the Spencer. Most of the other patterns were bought in lots of a few hundred to a few thousand. Almost all of them are gone now, and not in the sense of misplaced. In July of 1863, a mob in New York City burned 6,000 rifles of a single pattern in one afternoon, before most of them had ever reached a cavalry saddle. A soldier in a Virginia winter camp lost another on a single hand of chuck-a-luck, and the man across the fire never wrote his name down. A federal arsenal held 1,002 carbines of a third pattern in storage for 5 years and could not sell them at any price. 20 of the guns on this list are scarce enough that a handful of named collectors account for most of the known survivors. Number 20, a carbine that never reached a cavalry saddle because a mob burned the factory before the government's contract could be filled. Number 9, a rifle conversion built by the thousands and then quietly rebuilt into the design that replaced it, so that almost none of the originals survive as themselves any longer. $11 a month was a private's pay in this army. Tobacco alone could run a soldier half of it, and a sutler's whiskey, banned by every regulation on the books, was never more than a tent row away. Card games ran through every winter camp on either side of the war. Chuck-a-luck and faro and euchre, and one soldier's own account from the autumn of 1864 put it plainly: 9 men in 10 played cards for money. Whatever a man carried that could be staked, sold, or traded. Sooner or later somebody staked it, sold it, or traded it. This is not a story about what these guns are worth. It is an accounting of what a soldier, a sutler, a card table, a hospital cot, and a government suddenly holding more rifles than it would ever need again did with weapons nobody thought were worth keeping. Number 25, the Sims carbine. Lieutenant Sims of the United States Ordnance Corps built his breech-loading carbine to answer a question the Army was asking in earnest by 1857. Which of the new breech-loading designs actually put a bullet where a soldier aimed it? At a formal trial that year, tested against the Pulteney and Smith carbine, the Burnside, and the Maynard, Sims's design won outright. 100 rounds fired at 600 yards, his group beating the nearest rivals by more than 60 feet. A margin like that should have ended in a production contract, the kind of result that gets a design's name stamped into thousands of receivers. It did not. No volume order followed the trial. The sample carbines went back into ordnance storage, and when the war came 4 years later, the cavalry was armed with patterns already tooled for commercial manufacture, rather than the design that had actually won the government's own test. Commercial readiness, not accuracy at 600 yards, decided which carbine ended up riding into Virginia. The Ordnance Department kept the paperwork. It did not keep the gun in production, and it barely kept the gun at all. Verify exact quantity. Only a handful of Sims carbines are known to survive today, in institutional and private hands, the physical remainder of a trial the carbine won, and a war that never once called on it. Number 24, the Springfield Arms Company revolver. James Warner designed it in Springfield, Massachusetts, in the early 1850s. A percussion revolver with its nipples mounted on the side of the cylinder rather than the rear, built that way for one deliberate reason: to let the shooter rotate the cylinder by hand and avoid the patent Samuel Colt already held on a self-rotating hammer-cocked mechanism. It was a legal maneuver disguised as an engineering choice, and it did not survive a courtroom. Colt sued for infringement, won, and Springfield Arms Company was ordered to stop building the revolving cylinder version of its own gun. In 1857, Warner received his own patent for an improved version of the same idea, and tried again with a double trigger arrangement meant to sidestep Colt's claim more carefully. It did not work any better than the first attempt. Total production, by the standard collector reference, ran to well under 100 guns before the line closed for good, a full decade before a single Union soldier would ever need a sidearm. Warner filed more patents and fought more lawsuits before the decade was out. None of them resurrected this particular gun. Verify survivor count. What few of Warner's revolvers survive are concentrated in institutional hands now rather than private ones, sold off as curiosities once the courts had settled the matter and the line went quiet. A Massachusetts revolver, stopped in its first year of life, not by a war, but by a lawsuit that arrived 10 years ahead of one. Number 23, the Wesson and Leavitt Dragoon. The Massachusetts Arms Company of Chicopee Falls began building it in 1850 on patents held by Edwin Wesson and Daniel Leavitt, a large-frame revolver engineered to compete directly with Colt's own Dragoon-class sidearms in size, weight, and stopping power. Total production reached only about 800 guns before Colt's 1851 patent suit shut the entire line down. Again, the self-rotating cylinder, again the same Colt patent, filed and won a full decade before Fort Sumter, as if Colt had spent the 1850s clearing the field of every rival before the war that would make his own fortune had even been imagined. What survived the lawsuit did not survive the following 10 years of resale, hard carry, and the ordinary attrition that thins out any obsolete sidearm long before a war ever gets the chance to. The men who'd founded the company around it did better elsewhere. Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson left to found the company that would still bear their names when this one was forgotten, and Joshua Stevens left to found his own. The Dragoon itself is now one of the scarcest large-frame American revolvers of its era, a patent suit casualty that never got the chance to be a war casualty too, a gun that disappeared a full 10 years before there was a war to disappear into. Number 22, the Blunt and Sims revolver. Orison Blunt and John Sims ran a New York City gun house that was, by their own advertising, among the very first retailers in the city to carry Colt's revolvers over the counter, and alongside that retail business, the firm built its own small-batch pepperbox pistols and transitional revolving arms under the Blunt and Sims name. It was a maker's mark stamped onto guns sold from behind a counter that also sold its competitors' products, a New York gunsmith hedging every bet available to him. The transitional revolvers never reached a government contract of any size. The firm's business model was retail and small batch work, built for a counter trade rather than for a war, and never scaled up to the kind of volume manufacture the Ordnance Department needed once the war began. And what stock existed simply dissolved into the same private, second-hand channels that absorbed so much personal ordnance during the war years, sold across a counter, carried a season or two, then sold again to whoever had cash in a camp where cash was always short. Verify survivor count. Surviving examples are scarce enough that most advanced collections hold none at all. A storefront name that outlived the gun it once sold under its own label, the counter still standing long after the revolver that bore its name had gone out the door for the last time. Number 21, the Jenks carbine. William Jenks secured a Navy contract in 1841 for his sidehammer, mule-ear breech-loading carbine, a design old enough that the Navy was still accepting improved variants of it as late as January of 1861. 240 of the Remington-built, Maynard-primed Jenks Merrill pattern, taken into naval stores the same winter the Union itself was coming apart. By the time the guns Sumter would call to arms were actually issued, the Jenks was already being pulled from active shipboard service. Wartime inventories show at present aboard only a handful of vessels, a design from the age of sail still on the books the month the first shots were fired. Its side hammer and its mule ear loading gate already relics next to the newer breech loaders, coming off northern production lines by the thousand. Nearly every original smoothbore round-hole Jenks was later altered to a newer ignition system entirely. The Remington Maynard variant, only about 19% of total production to begin with, converted right along with the rest until an unaltered example became the exception rather than anything a collector could count on finding. A Navy carbine that was already an antique before the war that should have used it up ever started. Retired by its own service before the enemy it was designed to face had even seceded. None of that first stretch of guns ever failed on a battlefield. The Sims lost in a storage crate. The Springfield Arms revolver and the Dragoon both lost in the same courtroom a decade apart. The Blunt and Sims lost to its own ledger. The Jenks lost to its own calendar. Obsolete before a single Confederate ever got the chance to shoot back at any of them. What came next did reach a soldier's hands, rode into the war the guns before it missed entirely, and got burned, sued, and superseded instead. Number 20, the Gibbs carbine. William F. Brooks's New York City firm contracted with the Ordnance Department in 1863 to build 10,000 of these 52 caliber breech-loading carbines, and completed only 1,052 of them. On July 13th of that year, a mob protesting the federal draft burned the Phoenix Armory to the ground, destroying 500 finished Gibbs carbines and 6,000 more still in partial assembly in a single afternoon. An entire war contract ended not by the enemy the carbines were built to fight, but by a riot 3 blocks from the factory floor. Documented issue to the 10th Missouri Cavalry and to the 13th and 16th New York Cavalry adds up to only about 632 carbines out of the original 1,052 completed. The rest scattered into private hands, sutlers' back rooms, and the post-war surplus trade. The Gibbs remains one of the hardest Union contract carbines to find offered for sale today. Not because it was rare in the abstract, but because a mob decided, on one afternoon in July, exactly how rare it would become, burning 9 years' worth of Ordnance Department orders into a single column of smoke over Manhattan. Number 19, the Prescott Navy Revolver. Edwin Prescott built his New Hampshire revolver around a bored-through cylinder that could fire a self-contained metallic cartridge, and in 1862 the state of Kansas bought roughly 400 of them to arm militia units as a stopgap sidearm, while better supplied units waited on Colt and Remington deliveries. It was a militia gun, bought in a hurry, for men who needed something and could not wait for something better, and it moved through camp the way every stopgap sidearm moved. Traded up when a better gun came available, or traded away entirely for whatever a sutler's wagon happened to be carrying that week. Smith & Wesson held the master patent on that bored-through cylinder, the Rollin White patent that would end half a dozen makers on this very list, and their infringement suit closed Prescott's production within 2 or 3 years of its start. Total output is estimated at only a few hundred guns in total, the rarer iron frame model making up perhaps 1 in 4 of them. A Kansas militia sidearm, killed by a patent clerk in New England rather than by anything that happened on a Kansas battlefield. The paperwork traveling 1,000 miles east to end a gun the fighting itself never touched. Number 18, the Beals Navy and Beals Army revolvers. Fordyce Beals' 1858 patent gave Remington its first genuinely successful revolver platform, a winged cylinder arbor system that Remington built in 36 caliber Navy and 44 caliber Army configurations beginning in 1860 and 1861. Roughly 15,000 Navy-size guns and only about 2,000 Army-size guns were made before Remington's own improved new model line replaced the pattern in 1862. a design retired by its own maker within 2 years of reaching full production, quietly dropped from Remington's own price lists, while soldiers who had already bought one kept carrying it into a war the company had already moved past. The larger, martially marked Army frame Beals is now one of the harder primary Civil War contract revolvers to find at all. Eclipsed by its own sequel before most of the men who carried it had even mustered out. It is a strange kind of disappearance, not destroyed, not burned, not outlawed, simply outdated by the company that built it, a full 3 years before the war that needed it was over, and left behind by soldiers the moment a newer Remington came within reach of their pay. Traded off at a discount to whoever in camp still wanted the older pattern. Number 17, the Union Arms Revolver. Verify manufacturer details. A small emergency contract producer built a Navy pattern revolver under the Union name during the opening scramble of 1861 and 1862, when the Ordnance Department was buying nearly anything with a cylinder and a barrel to arm volunteer regiments faster than Colt and Remington alone could supply them. It was a patriotic name attached to an ordinary wartime product. One of dozens of small makers who filled the gap the major contractors could not fill fast enough on their own. Production never approached the scale of the larger firms, and when the emergency contracts lapsed, the company's output simply stopped, its revolvers folding into the same second-hand market that absorbed every other stopgap sidearm of the period. Verify survivor count. What remains today is scarce enough that the maker's own corporate history is thinner than its collector description, a name chosen to sell patriotism to a nervous public, attached to a revolver that patriotism alone could not keep in production past the emergency that created it, and could not keep in a soldier's holster once something more reliable was on offer. Number 16, the Cooper Firearms Manufacturing Company Navy Revolver. James Maslin Cooper began building a double-action, 36 caliber Navy pattern revolver in Philadelphia in 1864, the war's final full year, competing for the private purchase market of officers who preferred to buy their own sidearm rather than carry whatever the quartermaster issued. Verify wartime carry evidence. The bulk of Cooper's production runs into the years immediately after Appomattox, but the earliest guns off the line overlap the last campaigns of the war, making the pattern one of the last genuinely new revolver designs a Union officer could have purchased before the surrender. Cooper's total output across every model it built was modest and short-lived, and the company did not survive the 1870s. It was a late entrant into a revolver market that was, within a year of the war's end, about to collapse under the weight of its own government surplus. A design that arrived just in time to be forgotten, along with everything else that had arrived slightly too late. Vaccine off wows, sold off cheap by veterans who no longer needed a sidearm and could use the cash instead. Cooper, at least, had a market to be outcompeted in, died of ordinary competition, the kind any late entrant risks. The gun after it never got that chance. It died of the same patent clerk who had already killed the Prescott Rollin White's bored cylinder, still doing its work years later. Number 15, the Allen and Wheelock Army Revolver. In 1861, Ethan Allen's Worcester, Massachusetts firm put a center hammer, 44 caliber Army revolver into production. The Ordnance Department purchased 536 of them that same year, nearly all of them issued to the 2nd and 3rd Michigan Volunteer Cavalry. A lip-fire cartridge variant followed soon after, produced in perhaps 250 to 500 examples between 1860 and November of 1863, when a federal court order, the same Rollin White bored cylinder patent that ended the Prescott, shut down production of every Allen revolver built on that system. 2 Michigan cavalry regiments carried this gun into the war, and both variants are now scarce enough that many advanced Civil War revolver collections hold neither one. An earlier Allen and Wheelock pocket model exists. It is a different gun entirely and its story belongs elsewhere. This is the Army frame gun alone, the one that actually rode into Michigan's saddles, traded hand to hand as men were killed, wounded, or discharged out of those regiments, passed from a dead trooper's holster to a live one without a word written down anywhere, and then quietly disappeared behind them. Number 14. The Remington Beals Pocket Revolver. Remington's earliest production revolver, built across 3 successive models between 1857 and 1860 and Fordyce Beals' original small frame patent, with roughly 7,500 manufactured across the entire run. Colt's own solid frame pocket revolvers undercut the open-top Remington Beals design commercially within its first few years on the market, and Remington ended the pocket line in 1860, a single year before the war that might have extended its working life indefinitely. What remained in dealer stock and private hands when the fighting began was carried, sold, staked at a card table, and lost like every other private sidearm of the era. Folded into a war its own manufacturer had already stopped building it for. A Remington product line that the war arrived exactly 12 months too late to save, its remaining stock scattered into pockets and haversacks before anyone thought to keep count. Number 13. The Howard Thunderbolt Carbine. Brothers Charles and Seabury Howard patented a lever-action, single-shot breech-loading system that the Whitneyville Armory built as a rifle, a carbine, and a shotgun between 1866 and 1870, with total production across every configuration under 2,000 guns. The Army tested it in the 1867 carbine trials and rejected it outright. The locking mechanism had a documented tendency to blow open on firing, an actual mechanical failure rather than a matter of taste, and the design was pushed back into the civilian sporting market it had never been built to serve. Only about 12 examples of the carbine configuration are known to survive anywhere today. A design that failed its own government safety test and then very nearly vanished along with the rest of a production run that never reached 2,000 guns in the first place. 12 carbines, standing in now for everything the Howard brothers ever built. Number 12. The Remington Split Breech Carbine. Designed by Remington's Leonard Geiger and Joseph Ryder, and built under contract by the Savage Revolving Arms Company of Middletown, Connecticut, with only about 5,000 delivered to the government across February, March, and April of 1865. A rifle company that had spent the war building somebody else's carbine because its own revolver line could not keep pace with Colt's. It was the last new carbine pattern the Union Army accepted during the war, and it arrived after the fighting that mattered was already finished. Almost none saw active field service at all. Most of the government's remaining split breech stock was quietly repurchased by Remington itself once the war ended, and resold to France, the pattern's own manufacturer buying its own product back, rather than let the surplus depress the market for what came next. The rolling block, a design the split breech had made possible and was then discarded to protect. The carbine that fathered Remington's rolling block never got to see what it made possible, quietly bought back, and quietly sold away before most of its own soldiers had even finished mustering out. Number 11. The Peabody Rifle. The Providence Tool Company bought Henry Peabody's dropping block patent and entered it in the Army's 1865 breech-loading trials, where an ordnance board judged it the winner over every rival system on durability, accuracy, and resistance to weather. The government adopted nothing from that trial at all, choosing instead to develop its own conversion in-house at Springfield Armory, the system that would become the Allen trapdoor, and left the trial's own winning design without a single American military contract to show for it. Total Peabody production across every market the Providence Tool Company eventually found reached roughly 112,000 rifles, and nearly all of it went abroad, to Canada, to Mexico, to France, to Switzerland, to Romania, to the Ottoman Empire. Armies that had never fought at Antietam or Gettysburg, equipping themselves with a rifle designed to win an American war they took no part in. Only a token domestic purchase, some 2,000 rifles bought by the state of Connecticut in 1871 and 1872, ever reached American soil at all. A rifle that won its own government trial left almost no trace in the army that had held the trial to begin with, its victory worth more to a Turkish or Romanian ordnance officer than to a single American soldier. That same government, having just sent its own winning design abroad, was about to spend the next 5 years telling designer after designer no, for reasons that had nothing to do with whether the gun worked. Number 10, the Roberts conversion. 74 separate breech-loading designs came before the same Ordnance Department board in a single sitting between March and June of 1869. 73 went home rejected, Brigadier General Benjamin S. Roberts' tipping block conversion among them. Roberts had patented the system in 1867 and licensed it to the Providence Tool Company, which spent 1869 and 1870 converting existing Springfield rifle muskets to the pattern for that submission, only to watch the board choose the Army's own in-house Allen system instead. The converted rifles that found no buyer went into the same surplus channels that absorbed every other rejected trial gun of the era, broken up for scrap iron or shipped abroad in the same crates as everything else the Ordnance Department no longer wanted to store. A general's own patent, tested fairly, and passed over cleanly in a single season when the Ordnance Department had 73 other rejections to process right alongside it. A rank and a war record that bought Roberts a fair hearing, and nothing more than that. Number 9, the Miller conversion. 2,000 surplus Model 1861 muskets went through the Meriden Manufacturing Company's shop between 1865 and 1867. Each one rebored and rechambered for a new rimfire cartridge under a patent brothers William and George Miller had taken out in 1865. 2,000 rifles is a real number, a real government contract, a real factory floor running for 2 full years in Connecticut, and then the same Allen trapdoor system that beat every other entrant between 1865 and 1870 beat this one too. Most Miller conversions were themselves eventually broken up for parts or altered again to a later pattern. Unmodified original examples are now the exception, rather than the rule. One more Connecticut patent, absorbed into the shadow of the design that replaced it twice over, once at the trial board, and again at the hands of whoever later took the Miller conversion apart to build something newer out of its steel. Number 8, the Needham conversion. A British inventor's design crossed the Atlantic to compete for an American contract. Joseph Needham had already submitted his breech-loading conversion system to Britain's own 1867 Ordnance Select Committee before it was tried, in a small demonstration batch against American surplus muskets in the same post-war wave of conversion patents. Verify U.S. quantity converted. The trial run was built to be judged against the Roberts, the Miller, and more than 70 other systems, not to actually arm anyone. A design tried once on American muskets and never asked back. What the trials produced, in Needham's case, was paperwork rather than soldiers. The name survives far more completely in Ordnance Board records than the gun does in metal. A conversion patent that exists today mostly as a line item in a government report, describing a rifle almost nobody in the United States ever actually held. Number 7, the Ward-Burton rifle, named for 2 Union generals, William Ward and Bethel Burton. This bolt-action, single-shot rifle chambered for the 50-70 government cartridge was built entirely at Springfield Armory in 1871 for Army trials. 1,011 rifles and roughly 300 carbines. The first bolt-action metallic cartridge weapon ever issued to United States troops. Field trials the following year turned up a weak safety mechanism and little real enthusiasm among the soldiers who carried it, and the Army chose the trapdoor system descended from Allen's own work over its own bolt-action experiment. The entire production run, never issued beyond the trial itself, and never even individually serial numbered, is the complete world population of the pattern. Nothing was ever built beyond that original 1,300 or so rifles and carbines, and nothing more ever will be. A design that made history by being first and then made almost none of itself at all, its place in the story larger than its footprint in steel ever was. Number 6, the Lee Carbine of 1865. William Lee secured a United States Army contract for 1,000 carbines at $18 apiece in April of 1865, founded the Lee Firearms Company on the strength of it, and subcontracted the barrels to Remington. A war contract signed the same month the war effectively ended at Appomattox. The government then rejected Lee's first deliveries over a caliber dispute. Lee's samples were chambered for 42 rimfire. The Army insisted the contract specified 44. The two sides spent the following 2 years arguing over a war that was already finished. Perhaps 255 carbines were ever completed under the contract. Roughly 100 sold commercially, and the rest left mid-assembly when the company folded in 1868. A contract signed in the war's final weeks, and settled, badly, only in the peace that came after it. A company that spent its entire existence arguing about a war it had arrived one caliber too late to properly join. Lee argued about a caliber. What's left on this list argues with something closer to irony instead. Designs that won their own trials and then lost to themselves. A gun built for a war that was already finished. One that a president touched with his own hands and that never became steel at all. Timing did what lawsuits and riots had done to everything before it. Number 5, the Star Carbine. Ebenezer Starr's breech-loading carbine, built in New York from 1858 onward, armed Union cavalry by the tens of thousands. Roughly 20,000 of the original percussion pattern between 1861 and 1864. Then 3,000 of an improved metallic cartridge model, 1865, with 2,000 more ordered before the surrender. Of every gun on this list, it is the one that most soldiers actually carried, and the one most likely to have changed hands over a card table, a bottle, or a debt owed to a sutler who had already been paid 3 times over in a single winter. A private in an $11 a month regiment did not need much of a reason to let a carbine go for cash or credit against the next requisition of tobacco. The moment Springfield Armory produced its own breech-loading conversion in 1865, the government's outside carbine contracts simply stopped. Star Arms closed its doors in 1867, a manufacturer put out of business not by a rival's product, but by its own customers' decision to build the next generation in-house. Total production was substantial by the standard of everything else on this list, but the same post-war disposal system that sold more than 1 million surplus muskets and rifles out of federal inventory between 1865 and 1870 absorbed the Star the way it absorbed everything else the Army no longer wanted. A carbine that armed whole cavalry regiments is now defined, like every other item here, by what did not come back from that disposal at all. A common gun made rare not by scarcity at the front, but by indifference behind it. Number 4, the ball-repeating carbine. E. G. Lamson and Company of Windsor, Vermont, built Albert Ball's 7-shot, tube-fed lever-action carbine under a government order placed in 1864. A side-loading mechanism and an underbarrel magazine that anticipated the lever-action repeating rifles the country would spend the next 50 years building. Only 1,002 were ever manufactured, and delivery was not completed until May of 1865, weeks after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. None were issued to troops. None were sold. The entire run sat crated in the New York arsenal, a war contract finished by a government that no longer had a war to use it in. The paperwork closed out, and the carbines themselves simply left where they had been stacked. In October of 1870, the Ordnance Department tried to auction the whole lot, ammunition included, to the highest bidder, and found no buyer at any price. The carbines went back into storage. A carbine designed to fight a war, completed the month the war ended, offered for sale 5 years later, and refused, not lost, not burned, not stolen, simply never wanted by anyone at all. A war contract fulfilled to the letter and then quietly filed away as if it had never happened. Number 3, the Springfield Model 1865, the first Allen conversion. Of every conversion system already on this list, the Peabody, the Roberts, the Miller, the Needham, only one actually won. Master Armorer Erskine Allen's original trapdoor system, built by converting existing Model 1861 rifle muskets at Springfield Armory, beginning in 1865, beat every one of them across 5 years of post-war Ordnance Department trials. Only about 5,000 were made, and in hard field use the extraction system proved weak and unreliable. Within a single year, the Armory had redesigned the action entirely, replacing the first model's mechanism with the sturdier spring extraction system of the Model 1866. The winning design of an entire era's worth of government trials was, within 2 years of its own victory, being broken down for parts or rebuilt outright into its own successor. Almost none survive today in their original, unaltered 1865 configuration. The rifle that beat every rival in the country did not survive being replaced by itself, dismantled at the very Armory bench where it had been assembled 2 years before. Number 2, the Lindsay Patent double-shot rifle musket. J.P. Lindsay's design fired 2 superposed powder charges from a single barrel, using 2 hammers timed to a single trigger so that the forward charge would detonate first and the rear charge would follow it a beat later. The Ordnance Department bought 1,000 of them in 1863 and 1864, and the 16th Michigan Infantry, veterans of the defense of Little Round Top, carried them into the field as if a war that had already asked a great deal of that regiment needed to ask one thing more. The timing mechanism did not hold up under the pressure of combat loading. Both charges could fire at once, an event that tended to destroy the musket and injure the man holding it, and the design's reputation collapsed inside the very ranks that had been issued it. That rarity was no accident. Many were deliberately disabled or cannibalized for parts once the men who owned them understood exactly what the mechanism could do. Fine examples in their original condition are correspondingly hard to find now. A rifle withdrawn not by a lawsuit, not by a factory fire, not by a government trial board, but by the simple refusal of soldiers to keep firing something they had learned, the hard way, to be afraid of, traded off, buried, or quietly broken apart by men who had watched what it could do to the man standing next to them. Number 1, the Marsh Patent breech loading conversion. Patent number 33,655, filed in November of 1861, belonged to S. Wilmer Marsh. A trapdoor-style breech-loading conversion for the Model 1861 rifle musket that described, on paper, very nearly the same hinged breech block Erskine Allen would build 4 years later, and that would carry Marsh's basic idea into more than 1 million American rifles under a different name. 25,000 were ordered under Marsh's contract. Abraham Lincoln personally examined the design. Verify exact circumstances of Lincoln's test. Not one of the 25,000 rifles ordered was ever delivered. What exists of the Marsh conversion today is a patent drawing, a signature, and an account of a test a president once watched. There is no production run to count survivors from, because the guns themselves were never built at all. 25,000 rifles were ordered into the world, meant for the hands of 25,000 soldiers who would never know they had almost been issued one. The world received a piece of paper instead, Not every gun on this list ended the way a gun is supposed to end: fired, worn out, handed down through a family. Some were staked on a hand of cards in a Virginia winter camp and lost to a man whose name the loser never troubled to write down. Some were sold to a sutler for the price of a furlough ticket home, a rifle traded for a train seat, and a few days in a house the soldier had not seen in 2 years. Some were left on a cot in a field hospital beside a man who did not need a carbine anymore, and no clerk ever came back to collect it. Some were traded to a sutler for a plug of tobacco and a bottle of whiskey the regulation said shouldn't have been there at all, gone for less than a week's pay and worth every bit of it to the man who let it go. Some were condemned outright by an ordnance board that had 73 other rejected designs to process in the same season and no reason to keep a 74th. And some of these guns, the Ball, the Marsh, the Sims, never made it that far into a soldier's hands at all, finished or unfinished by a factory or a patent office, then quietly absorbed by a government that by 1865 had more rifles than it would ever need again. The Ordnance Department sold more than 1 million of them out of federal inventory in the 5 years after Appomattox alone, and the disposals continued in smaller waves for a decade after that. It sold them to jobbers who sold them abroad, to armies that fought other wars with them under other flags in other countries, until even those wore out past use, broken down for scrap or lost to some other country's version of this same list. What is left in the United States today is a scattering: a dozen carbines in a case here, a few hundred revolvers in private hands there, a rifle stock rebuilt so many times over that nothing of the original gun remains inside it, a single unfinished stock in a museum drawer in Springfield, Massachusetts, and a patent drawing for a rifle that was ordered 25,000 times and built not once. No sutler kept a ledger of what he took in trade. No winter camp card table left a record of what changed hands over it. The men who carried what remains of this list are gone now, all of them. The guns went first.